Today, we're going to be listening to Susan Arthure. Susan lives in South Australia, but is from Meath. Last year, Susan graduated from Flinders University with a PhD for her thesis, A Long, Long Way from Clare to Here, an archaeology of the Irish in colonial South Australia. And this talk is all about how Clare migrants to South Australia, exported the clachán, a particular form of settlement found along the west of Ireland in the 19th century. And I'm very interested in hearing about clachans. One of the major changes in the Clare landscape across the 19th century was the disappearance of the clachán and a reduction in the population. But some of that population was going to Australia, and here in today's talk we're going to find about how they brought some of those settlement patterns and forms of social organization from Ireland with them. So that's enough for me. Without any further ado, I'll put you over to Susan, and thanks very much, Susan, for being here with us today.
Thanks, Terry, and thank you so much for having me and for the nice introduction as well. So yeah, I guess I'll just start because today what I want to do is talk to you about the history and archaeology of an Irish settlement called Baker's Flat. And it was in colonial South Australia that was settled in the 19th century, mainly by people from Clare, this Baker's Flat area. And these Clare people and their descendants remained there for nearly a century. So first of all, I'm going to talk about some pertinent facts about the colony of South Australia. So it began in 1836, and it was an experiment in colonial settlement. So unlike the other Australian colonies that began as penal settlements for the unwanted of the British Empire, South Australia was established as a colony of free settlers, and this was a great matter of pride that it was not established using convict labour. And in fact, South Australia was deliberately designed to replicate a slice of England in the Antipodes. It was essentially a plantation of British society in the south. And importantly, it was characterised by conspicuous capitalism. So it was based on a scheme called the Wakefield Scheme, and this scheme was one where already wealthy men, so these were the big English landholders, could increase their wealth merely by buying land in South Australia and waiting for it to increase in value. So Michael Davitt came on an Australasian fundraising tour in the 1890s. He visited South Australia and he described it as a utopia for land speculators and capitalists. So given that South Australia was supposed to be overwhelmingly English and populated by people called superior expatriates, it's not surprising that only very small numbers of Irish migrants arrived, and especially those of the poor Catholic variety. South Australia was well known for its antipathy towards Catholics, especially if they were poor and Irish. And invariably, Irish Catholics were described as ignorant, lazy, and dirty. Now, Baker's Flat, the area I'm talking about today, is located near Kapunda. In the mid-north of South Australia, it's about 75 kilometres north of Adelaide, which was the colony's major city and is the capital of the state today. And this area at Baker's Flat at Kapunda had been occupied by English colonists since 1840. So that was very early. So it was only 4 years after the colony had started. And it was as farmland began to expand out. So 1840, people arrived in Kapunda. In 1854, so how many years is that? 14 years later, Irish Catholics began to arrive in large numbers in Kapunda. And one of the reasons that they were coming to Kapunda was probably because of the man on the screen here, Charles Harvey Bagot. So Bagot had been a land agent in County Clare, and when he decided to move to South Australia with his family, he chartered a boat called the Burman, and he brought 224 Irish migrants with him. He handpicked most of them from people he had either known or employed in County Clare, and they landed at Adelaide in December 1840. So Charles Harvey Bagot intended to be a farmer, and he selected land for farming in the area around what was to become Kapunda. But a couple of years later, his young son found copper when he was out collecting wildflowers. And the reason he was collecting wildflowers was for the Botanic Gardens, who had put out a call for fauna and flora of the area. But he found this strange, sort of strangely coloured piece of stone. He brought it back to his dad, Charles Harvey Bagot. And then Bagot, together with another landowner, the English Francis Dunne, became the owners of what was to become Australia's first successful metal mine. It was booming. And as the copper mine grew, it needed more and more labour, especially unskilled workers who were going to supplement the skilled work of the Cornish miners who were there from the start. And this is where the Irish came in. There's some evidence that some of the Irish Catholic migrants who'd travelled with Bagot on the Burman joined him here at Kapunda. But there's loads of evidence that by the 1850s, many more Irish Catholics were coming to Kapunda to work in the mine, and that many of these were from Clare. In fact, across South Australia, the statistics indicate that from 1840 to 1866, so around the beginning of settlement, European settlement in South Australia, and in the sort of early pre-famine and post-famine years, Clare was the biggest single source of assisted Irish migration to South Australia. So there's a really strong Clare connection. So these Irish, the ones that came to Kapunda, settled on a large parcel of land near the mine. It was then lying idle and unused by the legal owners. And this was very convenient because it was very close to work. You could walk. It was about 500 metres from the mine. It was rent-free. And this was the land known as Baker's Flat. And the Irish quickly took it under their full control, even though they were essentially illegal occupiers. They quickly formed what was described as a close, fiercely Irish community. So about 500 people lived on Baker's Flat when the copper mine was at its peak in the 1860s and 1870s. And they had a really strong Irish identity that was very recognisable. They built houses that looked like Irish houses, and you can see on the screen there's a picture of a depiction of Irish-style houses on Baker's Flat based on some photographs from 1906. These Irish had a very strong Catholic faith. They walked 5 kilometres to Mass every Sunday. They danced to Irish music by firelight on a common area in Baker's Flat known as the dance floor, and they played hurling on Sunday afternoons. So the photos that you can see on the screen were taken on Baker's Flat in 1906. And when you look at them, you can see that the houses look very Irish. There's that rectangular design that's like 1 room deep. They're single story. The thatched roof is very steeply sloped. And the records of a court case that began in 1892 hint at more. So this case pitted the Irish illegal occupiers of the land against the lawful owners, who were some of the most powerful men in the colony. When I analysed the case records, it seemed that the Baker's Flat Irish may have adopted a traditional Irish way of managing land and community, the clachán and rundale system. And in this, houses were clustered together and the land was managed communally. This would result in a community that was characterised by strong kin networks, traditional ways of life, shared labour. So during that court case, a survey plan was prepared for the sale of the land. Now that sale of the land didn't end up happening, but this is the best map that we have of that time on Baker's Flat. And you can see the black rectangles indicating these are all structures on Baker's Flat, and they indicate how the houses were clustered together. And this is significant because there's no rows of streets, there's no apparent order of any kind, and it matches that traditional settlement pattern of the clachán. So clachans, of course, were widespread in 19th century Ireland. The dots on the map indicate all of the clachans that were in Ireland in 1840, I think that is. So clachan was a group of dwellings and outbuildings centred around an area of land. The people who lived there were often related through kinship, through family. Unlike a standard village or town, the clachán lacked infrastructure like streets or services like a church or shops. And although houses could have individual vegetable gardens and the stock was owned individually, the majority of the land was managed communally and cooperatively, using the cultural practice of rundale, a system of open field, cooperative farming methods. By the end of the 19th century, clachans had all but disappeared in Ireland, and this was the result of changes after the famine, the result of deaths, of emigration, and the clearances of the poorest people by the landlords from the land. But as the clachan system was dying out in Ireland, one appears to have been thriving in South Australia at Baker's Flat. So this is a rural area, and the land had not been occupied by Europeans until the Irish arrived. So when the British colonists first came to South Australia and moved up, that land where Baker's Flat is now was on Ngadjuri traditional land, the Ngadjuri people. By the time the Irish arrived, it was pretty much only the English and a few Germans and Cornish people. But the settlement practices on Baker's Flat reflect the decisions and the practices of that community of Irish people only. So we know that the things that were happening on Baker's Flat were things that were decided and done by the Irish. It's also important to remember that clachans are difficult to recognise for outsiders. For somebody observing Baker's Flat from the outside, the settlement would have appeared disordered, chaotic, illegible. It's hard to read those clustered dwellings as a type of order. And it's certainly difficult from the English landowner's perspective to see anything other than chaos in animals roaming freely without fences. And certainly this is the story that was recorded in newspaper articles at the time: chaos. Tumble-down huts, wretched hovels, cows, goats and geese, all running wild, no apparent order. So this is what Baker's Flat looks like today. It's farmland where the only clues that hundreds of people once lived here are the occasional heaps of rubble. There's about 13 heaps of rubble scattered around the site, and small artifact scatters on the surface. So my issue then is how to investigate a site which hardly anyone remembers anymore, and where there is very little documented in the histories. This is the plan: how to find a clachan. So first of all, a geophysical survey, which was intended to collect subsurface data. So basically doing ground penetrating radar and a magnetic radiometer survey to collect data under the ground that's associated with the original footprints of dwellings or outbuildings, any maybe fences or enclosures, old paths or roadways. And I was very keen to find the dance floor as well, where they played hurling on Sundays and danced by firelight. So then excavations following the survey to test the results of the geophysical results. And we ended up excavating 8 different areas of interest around Baker's Flat, covering more than 120 square meters. Then there was the cataloguing and analysis in the lab of the artifacts. So there were nearly 20,000 artifacts, ranging from ceramics and glass, about 1,000, 2,000 pieces of each of those, 264 buttons, and nearly 16,000 pieces of metal, often structural metal and often rusty metal as well. And then there was archival research to underpin all of those results. So looking at the South Australian newspapers, there were 23 newspapers for the time of the Baker's Flat community during that time. 23 different newspapers. We found 1,200 articles, about 200,000 words that mentioned Baker's Flat. State records held court cases, and particularly of interest was one by Forster et al. V. Fisher, which I'll talk about in a minute, which ran to nearly 1,000 pages. Family history data for details about specific families. And overall, I found data for 145 separate families that had all lived on Baker's Flat at some time between the 1850s and the 1940s. And I also looked at folklore data from the Irish National Folklore Collection in UCD to collect information about traditional building materials and methods, fireplaces and chimneys, floors and foundations, anything associated with building structures. So what I was trying to do with all of this research was to cover every element of the community, to try and find out about kinship and alliances, to look at how the landscape was being used, the types of vernacular architecture being built, and the artifacts of everyday life as well. So before we move on to the archaeology, I think we need a little bit more background. So the Irish occupation of Baker's Flat, as I've probably indicated by now, was not trouble-free. The Irish weren't very popular in the broader community. The general feeling was that they drank too much, that they were dirty, that they were lawless, that they didn't manage their animals in the approved way. So the animals were renowned for roaming freely without fences. And Baker's Flat was described as a blot on the landscape. And later, as the mine was winding down and it was no longer essential to have all these unskilled Irish workers living nearby, as the mine was winding down, the legal landowners wanted their land back. But the Irish had no intention of giving it up, and this led to continuing conflict. And the attempted eviction started in the late 1870s. One is captured here on the screen in a mural that was displayed in town for a while, where a group of spirited Irish women are shown, and they're seeing off the bailiffs with brooms and sticks and buckets of boiling water. This was not unusual on Baker's Flat, women being at the forefront of resistance. And it's resonant of the land war that was happening around the same time back home in Ireland. So during the land war, women were essential to the protests and the agitation. They taunted bailiffs, they threw mud and stones at police, they blocked roadways with their bodies. And the same thing was happening on Baker's Flat. The Irish Land War was well covered in the South Australian newspapers, and the Baker's Flat Land War was using the same strategies and the same tactics. There's a dramatic story from 1880 when three unfortunate men were sent by the legal landowners to erect a fence on Baker's Flat. Now, erecting the fence, this was a tactic that under the Real Property Act would help to establish their ownership. The women were having none of it. Up to 100 of them turned out to drive off the would-be despoilers of their hearths and homes. 100 wives and mothers. The men were perplexed, but they determined manfully to do their duty, and they started to dig a hole for the first fence post. At this point, they were able to withstand the jeers and the taunts from the crowd. But when one of the women struck one of the fencers on the head, things changed. This woman then leapt into the partially excavated post hole, declaring that any further excavation would have to be through her body. So the three men went into a huddle, and after a bit of discussion, they wisely decided to retreat. And they were sent on their way, as usual, by the women using brooms and sticks and shovels, described in the newspaper account as leaving the fair army in triumphant possession of the field. In the court case which followed, the 6 ringleaders were named. There were 6 women that were named: Anne Slattery, Mary Callahan, Mary Lacey, Mary Josie, and we have pictures of 2 of them. This one is Anne Hoare, and this is a picture from 1870, about 10 years earlier. So she would have been 55 at the time of the incident. And then this is Catherine Driscoll, one of the other ringleaders. And this is a picture from her older years, because she was about 36 at the time of this story. And interestingly, poor old Catherine, because the photo is side on, and all of the photos of her, according to the family historian, were taken side on because she got into an altercation with a boy coming home from mass one day, and he threw a stone at her, and she lost her eye. So that's Catherine. Very spirited woman. Anyway, the troubles on Baker's Flat grumbled on for years, eventually coming to a head in the Forster et al. V. Fisher court case, which began in 1892 with the aim of selling off the land and getting rid of the Irish once and for all. So the records of this court case contain hints at how the Baker's Flat land was being managed. The landowners offered some of the occupiers the chance to buy some of the land, and a series of affidavits highlights how the Irish were working together and the expectations of mutual obligation. So a man called Thomas Jordan, he occupied a hut and 1.5 acres. He said that the occupiers had already held 2 meetings to consider their position. So they had got together and talked about their position, and that unless they could run their cattle on the whole of the said section, this is 490 acres, They could not live there. And until they were forced to leave, they had all determined to remain. A man called Michael O'Brien, who occupied a hut on 1 acre, he appeared tempted, but he said, "It is no use my buying the land, because if I did, the others would go against me, and that any person who did buy the land would not be allowed by the other occupants to live there." So these and other hints in the affidavits are hints that this clachán and rundale system was in operation, where the Irish were making decisions together about how best to manage the land and cattle. In other court cases, it becomes clear that a man called Daniel Driscoll was the de facto leader for the community. The Driscolls were probably the most influential family on Baker's Flat. Remember Catherine Driscoll, who'd lost her eye and was 36 when she helped defend Baker's Flat? She was married to Daniel's cousin Patrick. Catherine was also Mary Lacey's sister-in-law. Mary Lacey was one of the other ringleaders of the women, and Mary had been born a Driscoll. So the Driscoll family is very important. And these family connections are important because family and kinship are at the centre of clachán settlements. On Baker's Flat, many people came from County Clare, although they didn't necessarily know each other there. Sometimes they forged links on voyages to South Australia, or different families created bonds through marriage or friendships. So remember I mentioned that there were 145 family names on Baker's Flat? This slide shows one small element of it. The image shows the marriages which generated 2 or more connections to other families, and it's a web of interconnections, of alliances, of obligations, and right at the heart are the Driscolls. So the family connections offer some insight into kinship bonds on Baker's Flat. The court records indicate how it was being run as rundale, and the clusters of houses on the 1893 map hint at a clachán. The photographs show Irish-style houses. So using this data from the archival record, I thought it should then be possible to see a lot more information in the archaeology, so evidence of the clusters of houses and Irish vernacular architecture. So in February 2016, we carried out a geophysical survey of the northern part of the Baker's Flat site. Over 5 very hot days, we covered a 240 metre by 100 metre grid using a magnetic gradiometer and ground penetrating radar. So the grid we covered is the outlined in red, and the entire Baker's Flat site is outlined in green on the screen. And to the left, that photograph shows you how dry and hard the weather or the ground was at the time, and you can get the sense of how hot we might have been. So we concentrated on an area. The reason we chose that area of the site was because it seemed from the 1893 map to have contained clusters of houses and also what was believed to be part of the dance floor. And these are the results. They show several areas of interest. There are some straight lines forming a rectangular and a triangular shape. That's the ones that I've now outlined in green. And since these are not naturally occurring shapes, they may indicate field enclosures, and they're about 80 metres wide and long and 40 metres wide. There are also some anomalies that appear to show various structures clustered together over near the top left. Over to the right, there's the dance floor with slag edging, and because they're very close to a copper mine where they were smelting ore, there's a lot of slag, so they were using the slag to, as it turned out, to act as hearths, fire hearths. So this is where they would have had fires. All of the brown lines are what we think were rough paths through the site. These results helped me to decide where to excavate. So as you can see, Baker's Flat is basically a big field with no obvious structures remaining above the surface. The red arrows on the screen indicate the areas that we excavated over 2 field seasons. This is some of us mid-excavation in the first field season. We were uncovering a lot of iron sheeting in the middle of the trench, which becomes important in a minute, and a wall dug into the side of the hill, which also becomes important. And that's where the person in front with the blue hat is sitting on that wall. So normally when we were excavating, there were about 25 people excavating at any one time in various parts around the site. So from that excavation, once it was complete, So we excavated it over 2 field seasons. It ended up revealing the remains of a rectangular Irish-style house that was dug into the slope of the land. So Baker's Flat is it's not really flat, it's on a really slight rise. And this house was dug into the hillside. The long rectangle shows you, the red rectangle shows you the outline of the house. On the left, where there's a sort of an orangey area, that's the wall that person was sitting on in the slide beforehand. So that slide there, where that person is sitting, is this bit down here on the left-hand side. And there's a little annex outlined in red to the east, which was also a familiar custom in Ireland, where people would create a small space with a single opening, and that would be used to shelter poultry or young animals. This is what we think that house would have looked like. A rectangular structure that is 1 room deep, 10 meters long by 4 meters deep. Typical Irish house of the time. It probably had 2 windows, based on the window glass we found at 2 locations. It had a thatched roof, which would have been covered over at some point by galvanized iron sheeting, which was the sheeting we were excavating from the middle of that trench. Underneath the thatch, which we found attached to the iron sheeting, was hessian, which was commonly used as a lining to prevent bits of thatch falling into the house. And then there was an extended frontage to accommodate a south-facing door. So you can see that door in front, just be in front of some cobblestones. We didn't expect to find the door facing south. We expected to find it in the main wall. But there's a prevailing wind that comes through at 3 o'clock every afternoon on Baker's Flat. And the only way you could live comfortably is if your door really faces out of that prevailing wind. So this was unexpected, but a necessity. And then there's a tiny annex at the front for the young hens, maybe. There's no evidence at all that a chimney ever existed in this house. The hearth was at the southern gable end, and the smoke would have escaped slowly through 1 or 2 smoke holes in the roof at each end of the house. So near this house, we also excavated another area, and I chose this area because there were 3 stones in a row sticking up out of the ground, and to an archaeologist, that always looks interesting. 3 large stones sticking up out of the ground looked like it might have been a wall, which it turned out it was. So once we took off the topsoil, the ground beneath was covered with a sort of a mixed rubble of brick and slag and stone. And it's likely that these had originally formed parts of the original wall of the structure, because when the current landowner's father, when he had bought the land in the 1950s, he tumbled all of the remaining structures, and his strategy was to tumble the walls in towards the center of the structure and leave the rubble in place. So what we were excavating from the top of this site was the original walls of the site, of the structure. So we found this small round structure, like it's circular, possibly maybe D-shaped, a building almost 4 meters wide, with walls that are built directly on the natural surface. The internal floor was smooth and unstained, and it was coated in a very thin layer of white lime slurry, imprinted at one point near the back by the base of a bucket. There was a stone entranceway, which I've outlined in green here, with the remains of 2 timber posts on the inside, set 82 centimeters apart, the right setting for a doorway. On the outside of that, there was an edging of mixed stone, slag, and brick. Immediately to the right, as you entered the building through that doorway, was a circular stone fire pit, and that still contained ash remnants. After researching various forms of Irish vernacular buildings, it looks like this is most likely to be a sweathouse. Like the clachán, these were ubiquitous in 19th century Ireland, but they were so discreet and hidden in the landscape that as they fell into disuse, they also fell out of memory. And this is what it might have looked like on Baker's Flat, nestled into the slope of the hill. Now, the primary purpose of the Irish sweathouse was for health, to sweat out an illness or an ailment. Before it was used, a fire would be lit inside for at least 2 days. And then once the walls and floors were thoroughly heated, the ashes were raked out. And then the floor was spread with green grass or straw to protect the user's feet. So here, because it was tumbled, we have no idea how high the original doorway would have been. But the doorposts are in the correct position to wedge a temporary door in place. And the clean nature of the floor is consistent with it having been swept out numerous times. So there were very few artifacts found at this occupation layer, and that aligns with the clean and unstained floor surface. It implies a deliberate effort to maintain it like this while the structure was here. And then the ripples and the bucket imprint are further evidence of the floor having been regularly washed down. So why would the Irish have built a sweat house on Baker's Flat? I think it's most likely because it was what they had always done to manage health, in the same way as the clachán and rundale system was what they had always done to manage land. The sweat house might have been another means, like the clachán, of giving the community every advantage. So especially in terms of managing health in the early days, when doctors and medicines were harder to come by. So we had found evidence of Irish houses, even a sweat house. We'd also found some indicators of large field enclosures and 20,000 artifacts. But in terms of the Baker's Flat community, I just want to finish off by looking back to its beginnings in County Clare. At the time the Baker's Flat was settled, back in Ireland, family connections were critical. Blood ties, family ties were a dominant force, both economically and socially, and these were underpinned by large families and strong family networks. At Baker's Flat, over the course of a century, there were 145 different families associated with the settlement, but of these, nearly 40% were from Clare. And this is actually probably an underestimate because some people, we don't know where they were from. Sometimes we know they were from Clare, but we don't always know where everybody is from because birthplaces were not always noted in the records. So on the screen are 56 family names from Baker's Flat that we know are definitely associated with County Clare because they originated in Clare and they came to Baker's Flat. For example, the Crows, the Donlans, the Dundans, the Hoares, the Liddies, the Meanies and Robinsons all came from villages and townlands near Ennis. The Conlans, O'Callaghan's and Hines came from around Ballyvaughan. And as well as shared points of origin like these, several connections seem to have been forged on the voyage to South Australia that were then cemented through marriage, as in the previous slide with the Driscolls at the centre. So what can we conclude from this work on Baker's Flat? Firstly, and very importantly, it's the first clachán to be recognised in Australia. Here, the Irish lived in a very traditional, cooperative community, and it was perched on the side of a capitalist economy that was driven by mining and big sheep stations and pastoralism. For close to a century, they continued to build structures in the Irish vernacular style. They managed their land and stock cooperatively, and they maintained strong kin networks. And those kin networks are really important. In the absence of kin networks based on blood, new networks based on shared origins and journeys, astute marriages, long-standing friendships and alliances were constructed. One family, the Driscolls, emerged as community leaders. Over time, as families intermarried and stayed on Baker's Flat to raise another generation, the community evolved, but remained strong enough to resist incursions from outsiders, to preserve a shared architectural style, to engage in cooperative land management. The other thing that's important is the central role of women. The clachán was managed without visible boundaries or fences. For the legal landowners, substantial boundary fences were needed to assert ownership and control, as well as to exclude the Irish. But when the owners sent in fencers to build a fence in 1880, almost 100 women, including 3 of the Driscoll clan, saw them off, and women remained at the front line throughout the occupation of Baker's Flat. The end result was that although the legal landowners could go to court and prove their legal title, the Irish continued to stay there, managing the land and stock and looking out for each other until they were either ready to move on or no longer needed the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for that wonderful talk. And I got to say, that's an amazing piece of work that really shows the importance of archaeology in conjunction with documentary research in giving us a picture of the lives of people that maybe there's little documentary evidence about, or if there is documentary evidence about, it's from people who were hostile to them. And I
Yes,
mean, there's so much in that talk. I love the idea of the dance floor being at the heart of the community, and you find
yeah.
evidence of that. And
It's
it's also
interesting because the farmer who currently farms that land, and he normally has wheat in that area, or he has sheep or wheat. And the dance floor, like, when he goes over and he plants his wheat, it doesn't grow. Or it's sort of so much smaller than everywhere else. So he was able to point out the dance floor to us
wow.
because he goes, that's where it is, because the ground is so compacted that after all of these years, we still can't get anything to grow on it. And then that's showed up in the geophys as well, this compacted area of ground. And I
That's
really like that, plus the slag that they were using for the fires.
that's amazing. The compaction caused by
Yeah.
years of dancing and
Yes.
killing. Um, and it's I mean it's an amazingly connected history where you have someone a land agent Bagot taking people from the west of Ireland to
Yeah.
South
Yeah.
Australia on
Mm.
a boat called Burma.
Burman.
If
Yeah.
Burma or
Mm.
Burman.
Burman, Birman.
Oh, not in reference to the country called Burma.
No,
No, that
no.
was my assumption. And it's also like fascinating to see the not just the connections, but also the parallels that you highlighted in comparing what was happening in the land war back home,
Yeah.
what was
Yeah.
happening with the attempt to possess or repossess
Mm.
Baker's flats. And also interesting that it was the men who were going out and were resisted by the women of Baker's
Yeah.
flat
Yeah.
were fencing, yeah, much as the stone walls would be being
Yes.
erected in the west of Ireland across what was previously the open fields of a clachán. And very also very interested to hear the mention of Wakefield,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
who I remember from the closing chapter of Capital, because it wasn't his first colonization unsuccessful because his workers um left him and
Oh,
went off into the bush to live freely. Um, but it's interesting all those plans of colonization
yes.
and
Yeah.
assisted emigration, and it was
Mm. Well, interestingly for Wakefield as well, because he wrote a letter from Sydney. It was called A Letter from Sydney, and talking about like like populating South Australia and like this wonderful scheme and so on. But he was actually in Newgate prison at the time because he had eloped with a 15-year-old girl who was a wealthy heiress,
uh,
and then had been caught and hurled in jail. During which time he used his time wisely to write up his colonization scheme and this letter from Sydney, but he was actually in Newgate prison.
That's an interesting aside. Yeah, if I remember, there was a lot of these kind of schemes in the 1820s, 1830s, early 1840s. It was Robert Torrens, if I remember rightly, a political economist
Yes,
from Derry,
yeah,
who I
Robert
think,
Torrens from Northern Ireland, from
yeah,
somewhere up north. Yeah,
yeah, Derry. I think
Derry.
he proposed exporting one third of the population of Ireland to Canada, which
Mm.
would be an interesting alternative history had it happened. Um, I have a few questions for you Susan um that or a few just issues that we might inquire into. I was wondering, did you find any evidence of social stratification within the Clachán? As a, I'm just thinking of what was it that made the Driscolls into the most influential family. Yeah.
Mm.
And my other kind of related question is if you could speak to the well, I have I'm sorry, I have hundreds of questions, but if you could speak to the livelihoods of the people, the inhabitants there, because okay, some of the time they were working in the mines, then
Mm,
they were supplementing that with this farming, but they also seem to me, to my eyes anyways, but perhaps it's the eyes of someone who associates a clachán more with Ireland in the first
mm.
decades of the 19th century. They seem to be reasonably prosperous when I look at the photographs, yeah.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
of the ladies was quite well dressed, and
Mm.
like also they had photographs. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think the population on Baker's Flat was varied. So there were a lot of people that were incredibly poor, and they were not living in little houses. They were living in like tarpaulins that were attached to the end of a shed or something like that. And then you had other people that had houses and little bits of land associated like with them as well. Um, so in terms of the stratification, it's interesting because I don't know how the Driscolls became the leaders. Like, I don't know if that was deliberate or if it was just chance because maybe Daniel Driscoll was like articulate and good at arguing the case. He was described in many court cases as the spokesman for the community. And he was also, by one of the landowners, described as Barabbas because obviously he was betraying capitalism by living in this cooperative system. So they were clear, and also the Driscolls were very well allied through Baker's Flat with good marriages to other people that were also sort of important. But they had obviously a really strong sense of responsibility because the top area of Baker's Flat where we excavated is still called Driscoll's Paddock, so Driscoll's Field, by the landowner.
Mhm.
Because when the land, so the clachán existed, people lived on it. They lived rent free, they never paid rent. So most of the men were working in the mines. The women were raising flocks of geese and hens and eggs, and they were selling those. What I think they were doing was saving as much money as they could because as land opened up, they then went and bought their own farms later on. So by the end, by probably the last 20 years, there was only the very, very poor. Even by the last 30 years, there were only very, very poor and elderly women, maybe widows, that were living on their own in Baker's Flat in very straitened circumstances. At that point, the land had finally been sold and it was sold to one of the Driscolls. And he kept that land and did nothing with it until the last person died on the site, which was one of the O'Callaghan sisters who died one of them died in 1944 and the other in 1945, in the 40s anyway. So in the 1940s. And it was after that that he sold the land to the current landowner's father. So I think that Driscoll responsibility was retained right until the very end. And then when the last person died, that land was no longer needed and he could sell it on. So I think it's a really strong community that existed for all of that time. And then people did move on. They moved on to other mines and they moved on to other farmland as well, which they bought.
I got to say, Susan, that's a happier ending than I was expecting. So that's a good aspect of the presentation as well. Um,
And the Dundons that came from near Ballyvaughan, and they were a big family. And within only a few years, they had raised enough money. I mean, there were a lot of boys in the family who
yeah,
had then been able to work. So they raised enough money to buy farmland opposite Baker's Flat, and they owned that land for a very long time. So yeah, yeah, people like a lot of people were very very poor, but some people, you know, did well, and there was a sense of care, I think, around the whole community.
can I just come in there with two quick questions? And when you say near Ennis, would you remember the because we're going to be mostly going out to a Clare audience here, would you remember any of the specific places? And my
Mm.
yeah, well, sure we'll address that one, I think best.
Yeah, so have it written down somewhere near Ennis. Shared origins. I've got a section here. Okay, so Ennis. Clondegad, Kilmaley, Milltown, Newmarket, and Fergus, Slavine.
Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
And Carron and Tubber up near Ballyvaughan was where some of them came from as well.
okay, wonderful. Yeah, it's just amazing listening to I mean so much stuff that's familiar from the Irish context, like no chimney,
Yeah.
sweat houses, iron sheeting as well. 'Cause it just reminds me of the land league huts that were built for evicted people from galvanized sheeting. Um Yeah, I just. Oh, the other final question I wanted to ask you quickly. Is there any evidence of them continuing as Irish speakers?
Ah, now that is a very interesting question and love one that I would love to answer. No, there is no evidence, but one of my colleagues at Flinders has done a lot of work on the Irish language in Australia. And she also found, no, because she was the one who had talked to me about Baker's Flat to start with. She also found no evidence of um, Irish speaking on Baker's Flat. However, when you read some of the newspaper reports that are reported like verbatim of court cases, there is definitely Hiberno English because when people are talking about I'm out after hunting the cattle, this is not something that an English person would say. So they're using terminology that is, associated with sort of that Hiberno English language. And also there was an oral history collected from one of the Liddies in the 1970s, one of the Liddy descendants. And she remembered her grandparents speaking Irish by the fireside. And they were at Baker's Flat and then they moved west to farms on the Eyre Peninsula. But she still had a couple of words. She could remember a couple of words of Irish that her grandmother had taught her. And that would have been over quite a long period of time. So there were definitely Irish words being spoken. I don't know, but there's no evidence, we haven't got that, of whether people were speaking Irish as their first language.
Thanks very much, Susan. I've really enjoyed this your presentation and this discussion. We'll wrap up now, but I hope to read more of this work in the future. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.